The night I proved an entire lakeside neighborhood was sitting on my grandfather's land. You could hear the projector humming over people trying not to panic, and I swear that sound was louder than any shout I heard all year. 62 families packed into that clubhouse, staring at a county map on a white wall, realizing the roads they drove, the shoreline they bragged about, the trails they wandered, even the ground under their decks, all traced back to one man, my grandfather Curtis Redmond. And by the time that room understood what their HOA president had done to me, her little reign was already finished. My name's Nolan Redmond, and this all happened at Hawthorne Lake down in the low hills of eastern Tennessee, about 50 minutes south of Knoxville. My grandfather bought that land back in 1962, 160 rough acres nobody wanted, because a logging company had already stripped out the good timber and left behind ridge brush, rock, and shoreline. But my grandfather had spent more than 2 decades as a county surveyor, and he could read land the way some men read faces. He looked at that parcel and saw what other people missed: the whole northern shoreline of Hawthorne Lake, the ridge above it, the access roads, the shape of the ground, the way it all fit together. He built the cabin in 1974 with his brother Lloyd and a mason named Otis Falk from Sweetwater. Stone foundation, white oak, framing cedar shake roof, wraparound porch looking down through the trees to the water. Nothing fancy in the flashy sense, but solid, patient, built by men who expected things to last. That cabin held half my family's memory. My father proposed to my mother there. I learned to fish off that dock. My sister got married there in a thunderstorm that should have ruined the day and somehow made it feel holy. Then in 1983, a developer named Roland Price came along, wanting the eastern slope for a subdivision. My grandfather didn't sell it. That's the piece everybody missed. He leased 30 acres for 50 years. Long-term ground lease. Homes could be built, roads paved, utilities installed, HOA formed. But the land itself never left his name. That mattered more than anybody understood, mostly because nobody bothered to read the paper trail. My grandfather died in 2021. My dad was already gone by then, so the property came to me through a clean chain of title deed, lease surveys, tax records, everything locked in a fireproof safe in my apartment in Chattanooga. For a few years, the cabin sat empty, and life got in the way it does when it decides to come at you from 3 directions at once. I was working brutal hours as a structural engineer, dealing with a custody mess with my ex, and just trying to stay upright. But that spring, I finally decided enough was enough. I quit my firm, took a remote consulting job, rented a U-Haul, and headed for the cabin for good. I thought I was going home. I did not realize I was driving straight into somebody else's little kingdom. I got there on a Saturday morning in late April. The access road was narrow and rough gravel pushing up through old ruts, tree limbs scraping the top of the truck the whole way down. I backed up to the porch, dropped the ramp, and started unloading. First thing I carried was my grandfather's rocking chair, white oak hand-turned legs, old and smooth in all the places a man rests his hands. I was lifting it through the front door when I heard tires on gravel and looked up to see 2 Blount County Sheriff's cruisers coming down the road with lights flashing. You ever have one of those moments where your body gets there before your mind does? That drop in your stomach, that little cold wave in the chest, I had that. 3 officers got out. 2 younger deputies and a sergeant named Hargrave, the kind of man who already looked tired before he opened his mouth. He asked me to step away from the truck. Told me they'd gotten a 911 call about a break-in at a vacant lakeside property, possible armed intruder. I remember just standing there with my grandfather's rocking chair half inside the cabin thinking, armed intruder, I've got a lamp, 2 boxes of books, and a frying pan in the truck. I gave him my ID, showed him the deed, the tax receipt, the attorney letter confirming the chain of title. He read every page, slow and careful, then handed it back and said, "Sir, you're clearly the property owner." That should have been the end of it, but then I saw who'd called. Behind the cruiser, sitting in a white Lexus SUV, like she was supervising an invasion, was Pamela Denton, president of the Lakeshore Pines, HOA. Mid-50s, frosted hair, sunglasses she wore like rank insignia, lanyard around her neck that said HOA board in block letters. She didn't even get out at first, just sat there watching. After the deputies cleared out, she finally walked up with a clipboard tucked to her side like a shield. No apology, no hello. Just, this is a Lakeshore Pines community area. You can't move into a structure without board approval. I looked at her for a second because I honestly thought maybe I'd misheard her. This is my cabin, I said, on my land. She tilted her head, that little expression people wear when they've decided they're the only adult in the room. We'll see about that. Then she turned and left. Those 4 words told me exactly who I was dealing with, not somebody confused, not somebody mistaken, somebody offended by the existence of a boundary she didn't control. 6 days later, I got the first letter. HOA letterhead. Pamela's signature. 4 violations. Unapproved. Exterior paint. Non-compliant roofing. Unauthorized vehicle storage. Failure to submit modification paperwork. $300 a week until corrected. Threat of a lien if I didn't comply. I read that thing on the porch with coffee in my hand and a pair of wood ducks moving across the lake like nothing in the world could possibly be urgent. Then came the lawyer letter. Some little attorney above a barber shop claiming the HOA had oversight over my cabin because of its proximity to community infrastructure. That one made me laugh once quick and sharp, then stop laughing just as fast, because I knew now this wasn't going away on its own. So I called my attorney in Knoxville, Davis Cop. Land use guy, smart, calm, not easily impressed. I read him both letters. He went quiet, and when Davis goes quiet, it usually means somebody else is about to have a bad day. I sent him the deed, the ground lease, the surveys, the tax records. He called back the next afternoon and said, "Nolan, your grandfather didn't just own the cabin. He owned the ground their houses are sitting on." That was the moment the whole thing changed. Not the cabin, not just the road, the land under the subdivision, the shoreline, the access routes, utility corridors, shared infrastructure. Everything tied back to that 1983 ground lease, and buried in it was the clause that mattered. My grandfather retained the underlying parcel, the roads, the shoreline frontage, the rights to the remainder of the estate unimpaired. In plain English, they were tenants, and their HOA president had called 911 on her landlord while I was carrying in a rocking chair. You don't forget a sentence like that. I didn't answer Pamela right away. I went to the county records office instead and pulled every document connected to my grandfather's parcel. Every plat amendment, easement, tax record, lease filing, all of it. The clerk, Miss Eunice, saw my pile and brought me coffee. Said Curtis Redmond's file was one of the thickest they had. Turns out my grandfather hadn't just been careful. He'd been surgical. He kept everything. And the more I read, the uglier Pamela looked. The HOA covenants only covered the leased 30 acres. My cabin wasn't in that parcel. My shoreline wasn't in that parcel. My roads and ridge weren't in that parcel. Even better, the HOA had been paying lease money for 40 years. Quarterly, regular as church bells. Meaning they knew, or should have known, exactly what the arrangement was. Pamela, meanwhile, had moved from letters into performance art. She started posting pictures of my cabin in the neighborhood Facebook group, always from the worst angle she could find, zooming in on weathered cedar or stacked firewood or a kayak leaning on the porch. Called it an eyesore. Called it a hazard. Called me a squatter. A squatter. On land my family had held since before half that neighborhood existed. That part got under my skin, I won't lie to you, not because strangers said stupid things online. People do that for sport now. It got to me because she was trying to turn ignorance into consensus. If enough people repeat a lie in a neighborhood, suddenly the lie starts dressing up like fact. But one of those homeowners, Wallace Keenan, wasn't buying it. Wallace was 71, retired science teacher, lived in one of the early homes out there, and had known my grandfather for years. He called me and said, "Nolan, this woman is stirring people up over a place she doesn't understand." Wallace ended up being the first crack in her wall. Pamela filed complaint after complaint with county agencies. Septic, well water dock, safety structure, hazard noise, light pollution, even wildlife feeding. 11 complaints in all. 11. County inspector comes out, walks the place, looks uncomfortable the whole time, checks everything. Clean. Building inspector I hired did the same thing. Clean again. Strong structure. Well-maintained. Safe. That was when I learned something ugly but useful. People who abuse power rarely start with something huge. They start with paper. Letters, complaints, warnings, little official-looking nudges, death by bureaucracy. They hope you'll get tired before they get exposed. My grandfather had a different habit. He didn't argue noise. He answered facts with records. That lesson hit me hard right about then. The truth isn't loud, but it lasts longer. So Davis and I got methodical. Cease and desist letter to the HOA and Pamela personally. New survey with GPS markers on every relevant boundary. Public records request for every complaint she'd filed. Then we found something that made my jaw lock. Pamela had pushed through a $12,000 lakefront beautification assessment and used it on signage, a gravel path, and an observation platform, built on my property without my permission. That's the kind of arrogance you only get when nobody has asked to see your homework in a very long time. Then came her worst mistake. She suspended the lease payments. Her attorney tried a fancy argument first. Abandonment, constructive termination, prescriptive control, all that polished nonsense lawyers use when facts aren't on their side. Davis cut it apart in one response. You can't claim ownership by hostile use while making rent payments to the person you say doesn't own the land. Pick one fantasy, not two. But Pamela didn't wait. She pushed a board vote to stop the payments entirely. That triggered the default clause. 30 days to cure. After that, I had the right to terminate the lease. Now, I had no interest in blowing up 62 families over one woman's ego. Never did. Those people had bought homes, raised kids, planted gardens, paid dues, lived their lives. Most of them weren't villains. They were just trusting the wrong person. So before the deadline clock really set the neighborhood on fire, I mailed every homeowner a certified letter. I told them who I was, told them who my grandfather was, explained the lease, the land, the rights, the complaints, the false 911 call, the unauthorized construction. No threats, no drama, just record summaries, copies, dates, facts. And then the earthquake hit. Pamela went on Facebook calling me a hostile outsider and a con man. One of her lawyers filed for a restraining order, which the judge smacked down so hard, I thought the woman's pearls might crack. Pamela even staged a little unity rally on my own land, complete with matching shirts and handmade signs about protecting the lake from a land grab. I sat on my porch drinking coffee while she used a megaphone to tell people I didn't own the property she was standing on. Wallace sat beside me and said, "You could not write this and have people believe it." The real ending started at the community meeting. Howard Fisk, one of the board members, retired engineer sharp as a tack. One of the few people who'd voted against Pamela's madness, called a full meeting at the clubhouse. Packed room, standing room only, homeowners, spouses, grown kids, one reporter, even Pamela, though I think by then she knew the air had changed. I stood at the front with Davis and projected the county map on the wall. That map did more damage than any speech I could have made. I showed them my grandfather's parcel in blue, their subdivision in yellow, the blue wrapping around the yellow on three sides like a hand resting on somebody's shoulder. I showed the deed, the lease, the payment ledger, the complaints Pamela filed, the clean inspection reports, the board resolution stopping rent. I didn't rant, didn't call names, I just walked them through it. Then I said the one line that seemed to land hardest. Your HOA president stopped paying rent on the land your homes sit on without telling you. The room went dead silent. Then somebody stood up and asked Pamela if it was true. She tried to dance around it, tried to say the situation was complex. That's when Gail Morrison, a retired nurse with the kind of voice that doesn't need volume to cut, stood up and said Pamela needed to resign that night. And that was it. Pamela looked around the room, realized nobody was following her anymore, grabbed her clipboard and purse and walked out the side door without another word. 3 board loyalists drifted out behind her like smoke after the flame goes out. The homeowners voted that same night to remove her, restore the lease payments with back pay and interest, and install an interim board under Howard Fisk. You want the most satisfying part. It wasn't the courtroom. It wasn't the legal letterhead. It was that walk to the side door. The exact moment a woman who had spent months treating me like an intruder on my own land had to leave a room full of her own neighbors because the truth finally got there before she could spin it. After that, things moved, the way real consequences move, slower than revenge but heavier. Pamela ended up pleading no contest to filing a false police report, paid a fine, got probation. The HOA's insurer settled the civil mess. The illegal platform came down. The gravel path got restored. The signs disappeared. Homeowners got refunds on that special assessment money she'd burned on my property. And then, because this isn't a story about me trying to ruin people, the new board came to me with humility and paperwork and asked to renegotiate the lease properly. We did. New 50-year agreement, clear boundaries, fair rent, formal shoreline access for fishing, kayaking, swimming, shared road maintenance, liability coverage, clean, legal, neighborly. Exactly what could have happened from the start if one person had just walked down the gravel road, knocked on my door, and said hello. I still live in that cabin. I redid part of the dock last fall, restained the porch in the warm amber color my grandfather always used. Some evenings I hear families down by the water. Under the terms of our agreement, kids laughing, paddles knocking against aluminum, somebody teaching a child how to skip stones badly, and then a little better. Good sounds. Honest sounds, the kind my grandfather always wanted around that lake. And sometimes I sit in his rocking chair, the same one I was carrying when Pamela told 911. I might be armed, and I think about how thin power really is when it isn't tied to truth. Some people build authority out of titles, lanyards, rules, volume. My grandfather built his out of records, patience, and the simple discipline of knowing exactly what was his. In the end, that quiet kind of power is the one that lasts.
What do you think when somebody in an HOA lies over it and put an entire neighborhood at risk just to protect their ego? Should losing the position be enough, or should the consequences go even further? And have you ever dealt with someone who acts like they are everything around them until paperwork proved otherwise?